I love the flowers. I love the flowers.
The photos?
The flowers, I love the flowers.
Oh.
Nice touch.
Yeah, this is because of our delegation, you know.
Oh yeah, I'll get you after.
Okay, good evening to all of you. Welcome back. Welcome again. Many of you have been here already yesterday. We are setting up our philosophical circle here at the Institute. This is very nice. It feels very good. Yesterday I said this is a tripartite event. So welcome to the second in a series of 3. Yesterday I also mentioned my gratitude to Katarzyna Koczi, but I think it is worth mentioning it again. Katarzyna, thank you so much for setting up these 2 lectures yesterday and today, and the little workshop that will follow tomorrow. I think this you have done it very nicely, and you have done it very carefully with a lot of dedication. Yesterday also we had the artist Daniel Domik here. We forgot to mention him yesterday. Today he's not here, but I will mention him today that he's not here. I mean, in some sense, I think it's better to mention him in absence, right? Because he will find out later, and then it's even more powerful. So I would also like to mention the artist Daniel Domik, whose painting you have on display over there. That is the painting that you also saw on the invitation for the lecture series and on the poster outside. And I think it is also a further proof of how nicely and carefully you have prepared everything. Katarzyna, thank you for that. Very happy that we have with us tonight James Dodd. James is we say this often, but in this case it's really true, is an old friend of the Institute, which does not refer to his age, but to the long time that he has been affiliated to this institution. James, you have been a junior fellow at the IWM in 1995, if I'm not wrong?
1991 was my
1991, see, this is incredible.
Even older than you thought.
Yes. See, but you came back, right?
I've been coming back continuously.
And since then you have come back many times. And you also plan to come at an early point of the pandemic, I think in 2019. It had to be postponed, it had to be postponed again. Here you are finally. And we humans, we are monsters in creating meaning as a philosophical category, but also in everyday life we create a lot of meaning. So now that you're here, I think it is quite meaningful that you came this year and that we had to postpone, because it's very good that you could come for this workshop and that we have you here for that. James is a professor of philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. He is at the New School since 2002, so celebrating 20th anniversary at the New School. He has his PhD from Boston University. I mentioned just 2 books quickly because they very much have to do with what James will be talking also about tonight. First, Violence and Phenomenology, a book from 2009. And another one with a very similar topic titled Phenomenological Reflections on Violence from 2017, Routledge. Besides being a recurrent fellow to the IWM, James has also been a Humboldt Fellow at the Husserl Archive in Cologne. He is, and this should not go unmentioned on an evening when he will especially speak about the philosophy of Yampatoshka. He is a very meritorious editor of several books by Patočka. Body, Community, Language, World, a collection of lectures. Introduction to Husserl's Phenomenology, and not to mention least the heretical essays that you have edited in English. I have also the honor that we have edited a book together, James, which is also in topic very close to what you will be discussing tonight. Religion, War, and the Crisis of Modernity was the title of our special issue for the new yearbook of Phenomenology and Phenomenological Philosophy that we edited together in 2015. Many things I could mention about you, I will leave it out. Husserl is a very important name in your philosophical biography. Maybe Kant as well, but 2 people that should not go unmentioned are those who were very influential as your teachers to you, and this is Christophe Michalski, the founder of this institute with whom you studied, And Erazim Kohak, a Czech professor teaching at Boston University, whom you met there, and who was also very influential in shaping your career and your philosophical interests. And I think these two people it is worth to mention at the beginning as well. James, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Ludger. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Katrina, for inviting me to be part of this series. It's always a great pleasure of mine to be back at the Institute and have a chance to catch up with old friends and to have the opportunity to meet new friends. So I'm very much hoping that what I'm going to present tonight will enable us to continue our discussion from last night and then hopefully carry through into yet further discussion tomorrow. My contribution to this discussion on war and sacrifice will be more exploratory reflections than developed whole. What I'm going to present consists of several fragments from essays recently published and forthcoming presented without a conclusion. They do not cohere into a theory or even a unified perspective. At most, they serve to indicate what I take to be the philosophical challenges represented by the existential questions at play in reflections on war and sacrifice. More specifically, I will attempt to articulate two problems that I take to be central to any philosophical account of war: the problem of its violence and the question of peace. In several aspects as well, I will treat of the themes of war and sacrifice as it developed in Yampatoshka's heretical essays and other texts from the period. So first, let us consider the problem of the violence of war. A great deal of the activity of war takes the form of preparations, such as the massing of resources, physical and human, the arrangement and concentrations of force dispositions, the definition of the battle space, and much more. Such preparations are so intricate and energetic that it is often tempting to consider the violence of war as almost an afterthought, perhaps even an unnecessary agreement. Karl von Clausewitz had looked with scorn on those who, inspired by the relatively limited professional wars of the 18th century, put so much emphasis on the role of maneuver and other tactical devices such as interior lines, that the actual use of violence was almost taken to be a sign of failure. Yet this opposition is an exaggeration. In a broad sense, violence is arguably inscribed in all the activities of war, including its preparations, which after all ultimately serve to position oneself to be able to either strike the enemy or husband the capacity to withstand a blow. This is as true in offensive preparations as defensive, in a strategy of annihilation as it is in one of attrition, none of which can be understood outside of the horizon of potential violence. What characterizes the violence of war is thus, at least in part, a thoroughgoing grasp of the potentialities of violence, expressed in the form of war preparations and mobilization. So warfare, one could say, is an art, a technique, in which the instrumentalization of violence forms its inalienable core and inner driving force. This is true of all the arts of war throughout history, from ancient martial arts in which the individual body is weaponized, to the mass mobilization of nations in the world wars of the past century, in which the social capacity for collective industry and symbolic production was weaponized on a massive scale. The violence of war is thus in this way constituted by a calculative intelligence coupled with an expanding knowledge of the possibilities of destruction that lie at the intersection of our vulnerabilities and our capacity to exert force, whether it's individual bodies or collectives. Yet for all our capacity for calculation and knowledge of how to destroy human beings individually and collectively, violence remains elusive. In the end, it is instrumentalized only in an indeterminate, incomplete fashion. For violence is never something that unfolds precisely as predicted, but on the contrary, invariably opens a space of hazard or of chance. No other human activity, as Clausewitz put it, is so continuously or universally bound up with a chance. One reason for this is the simple fact that the best preparations and provisions for battle are inevitably subject to the vagaries of the unforeseen. Clausewitz called this friction, that drag on action that results from the burdens of the unanticipated, complications in which any move is checked with an inexorable resistance characteristic of the environment of war. War is a constant struggle with conditions, the weather, opportunities met and lost, psychological factors such as morale and courage, unanticipated political events, and a chronic lack of adequate information. Thus, to again quote Clausewitz, It may very well be that everything in war is very simple. Violence, in other words, is stupid. But the simplest thing is difficult. Thus, even if the violence of war is to a very high degree instrumentalized, that means both conceived and organized in increasingly sophisticated ways, the inevitable contingencies of conflict forego the possibility of defining any real laws determining the conduct of war, apart from some general principles that are themselves chronically open for revision. Warfare is thus an art, not a science, a discipline, not a body of knowledge that can be systematized. Another reason that war is so bound up with chance is that the violence specific to war operates precisely in the caesura between the planned and the unanticipated, or that tipping point in which preparations run aground in friction. Violence is precisely an attempt to quicken this encounter in a bid to shape events by way of distorting the environment in which they unfold in ways that frustrate the capacity of the enemy to retain balance. For the act of violence is precisely the refusal to allow anything to be given as fully determinate or determinable, instead positing a radical refusal at the heart of things, an obstacle of mute force aimed directly at denying the attempt of the enemy to inhabit the field, or in general be in any measurable control of space or time. As a kind of willful anarchy, the violence of war is chronically blunt. It threatens to unravel its own organization the moment it is deployed in a gamble with an unknown that risks the one who wields it just as much as the one who resists. In this way, the violence of war takes the form of a kind of planned confusion, an orchestration of chaos aimed at the very capacity to field violence itself, namely the fighting capacity of the enemy, who has entered the field prepared to do the same. This means that the violence of war can never be reliably directed by any art of war, for which the violent act initiates a breakdown, the consequences of which cannot be determined in advance, only subjected to a shifting assessment of probability and the opportunistic instincts of the gambler, and always clouded by bad faith. We might also, in reference to the reflections of another thinker of violence, Jean-Paul Sartre, emphasize that the horizon of war violence is not only opened by the collision of an anticipation of a probable outcome and the anarchic moment of chance quickened by violence, but also the past legacies of violence that serve to shape and often distort subjective comportment itself. The legacies of past wars, inscribed into what Sartre described as the domain of the practical inert, condition the reality of any war, perhaps to an even greater degree than the actual technologies of destruction deployed. The praxis of past violence saturates the present, embedding itself deep in our psychology, giving a particular shape to the whole of our social relations. What we fear, what we are willing to risk, even what we can imagine to be possible, is a direct consequence of the history of destruction of which we are the troubled heirs. This allows us to supplement in an important way the Clausewitzian emphasis on psychological factors. The point is not so much to catalog the spiritual characteristics of an individual or collective, which often gets bogged down in empty speculation regarding the warlike or unwarlike character of a given society or group, but instead to understand the historical context as a product of a confrontation between the realities of the past and the possibilities of the present. And it is here that the excesses of past violence stand out as poignant, but also ambiguous. Awareness of the violence of the past may lead either to a recoil of horror, giving rise to a desire to arrange the world in a way such that the crimes committed in the past will never again be possible. Yet it can lead equally to a reckless impulse to push forward even further, throwing the world into an even greater chaos and an ever more costly gamble. Here perhaps we have an indication of the imaginative resources for the obscenity of war, its inherent tendency towards abomination, the breakdown of the very conditions of morality. Ironically, the same sources also yield an equally inherent tendency for wars to be limited affairs, falling well short of realizing the full potential for violence in the face of an instinct for self-preservation awakened by the memory of past suffering. Here lies, I would argue, the problem for philosophy. If anything, it is in its violence that something like the essence of war can be formulated, since violence appears to provide a key to the fundamental movement of war taken as a whole. Yet at the same time, violence invariably points to the specter of an utter nihilism at the core of war, and with that at the core of any human situation that would count war, past and present, as one of its formative elements. There can be no philosophy of war, in other words, without a philosophy of nihilism. problems of a philosophy of nihilism are copious, but in relation to the problems of war, the issue boils down to one. Is a philosophy of nihilism possible in any other form than as an overcoming of nihilism, a movement beyond nihilism? Or does the reality of an irreducible nihilism, whether in general or that of war itself, precisely the point at which philosophy is rendered impossible? The problem of violence is bound up with the second problem I wish to sketch, the problem of peace. The legacies of past violence, the practical inert that arises from the distortions of past destruction, form a series of fundamental conditions constraining the very possibility of peace. Coupled with the character of war as prepared violence, any time of peace is fraught with the double distortion of past and anticipated violence. There is no peace that is neither a preparation for war nor the failure to do so. The more humans are conscious of history, and with that the more they live historically, the more forceful this constraint. Yet for all that, it would be a mistake to conclude that peace lacks autonomy, that is reducible to a tense truce that occasionally interrupts the reality of universal war, or that it merely represents war fought by other means. Something similar is the case with politics. Foucault's widely cited inversion of Clausewitz, that politics is war pursued by other means, because politics is power, and power an exercise of force, overlooks the core of Clausewitz's thesis, namely that war can never be an end in itself, but is always in the service of a greater political logic. And the ultimate end of politics at play in war is not war, not power as an exercise of force, but an advantageous peace. For Clausewitz, this implied a capacity for policy to judge appropriate the possible course by means of either military action or diplomacy, or a combination of the two, towards the cessation of hostilities and a resumption of an agreed-upon peace. Likewise, the other popular attempt to problematize Clausewitz's dictum, namely the riposte that war is not politics pursued with other means, but the failure of politics, misses the point equally. There are, of course, plenty of cases where failed policy results in a ruinous war. Nevertheless, bringing any war to an end is ultimately a political endeavor, so at some point the primacy of politics must reassert itself for the sake of peace, and it can do so only by again shouldering the war in order to conduct it to its conclusion. In the end, the Clausewitzian insight is that war is never a complete substitute for politics, nor can it function independently from politics. A corollary might be that war is never a substitute for peace either, and however temporally brief, however threatened by the prospects of war, peace remains as the logical touchstone for any war, whereas the converse is not the case. To drive war and warfare beyond the confines of the logic of peace renders each incomprehensible, unmoored, effectively meaningless. Even a militarism that would seek to dress all political discourse in the symbolic forms of war remains at least implicitly dependent upon peace for its own ultimate sense. Otherwise, it is madness. Of course, to claim that something to be madness is not equivalent to demonstrating its impossibility. On the contrary, if anything, the legacy of the 20th century would seem to have affirmed at least the possibility of something like a total war, a war that not only absorbs all the resources of society, but absorbs all its symbolic activity, including politics as well. Just as for Clausewitz, the experience of the Napoleonic Wars seemed to have made the otherwise abstract concept of absolute war, or war driven inherently by an unmitigated escalation of possible violence, a reality, so too the long period of conflict between 1914 and 1945 seemed to have made the even more terrible specter of total war a reality as well. Yet it remains a question whether this is just an appearance, whether the global conflicts of the past century are at bottom only conceivable in terms of a dialectic of war and peace that, however different it may be from the 19th or any other century, nevertheless remains valid. This seems to be the conclusion of Raymond Aron, who, after his intensive study of Clausewitz, attempts to apply Clausewitzian principles in analysis of the post-1945 world. Aron's conclusion, however, runs up against a difficulty, one that I would argue is intrinsically philosophical. For it is difficult to judge just to what extent war and peace form a dialectic that can be meaningfully reconstructed in conceptual terms. For each in turn, war and peace, is grounded in an experience that seems to entail the unreality of the other, as if each exercised a kind of magical suspension that in and of itself does not necessarily open the horizon of its own modification. We do not necessarily return to war after a peace, thanks to which war means something different, richer in content, nor do we necessarily return to a peace after war to discover a condition that is any more resilient, as if tempered by the experience of war. We are more likely to be haunted by the unreality of the halcyon times of peace during war, and vice versa by the nightmare of war during peace, as if each represented an existential breach of the other that belies any claim that war and peace are two parts of a common, integrated, logical unity. There may very well be the developments, even dialectical in nature, that we can trace in the history of war as a human activity, but the idea of a dialectic between war and peace themselves, the extent to which such a dialectic would entail some logic of a whole, is at the very least an open question. But for all that, war and peace are clearly inseparable, even if from the position of either, they can seem to be absolutely or perhaps fatefully separable. Each reveals in very concrete ways the unreality of the other, and in this sense threatens a kind of contradiction without resolution. Here again we are perhaps faced with the need to recognize the place of nihilism. Here also lies the fundamental problem of peace for philosophy, which is at the same time just the problem of war itself. How to think each in terms of its other, and not emerge as a naive partisan of peace, for whom war is a false reality ripe for eradicating from the world, nor a cynical partisan of war, seeking to reveal the utter spiritual bankruptcy of peace. Yet can philosophy be anything but a partisanship of peace? Would not anything short of defending the idea of peace amount to simple barbarism, as Rousseau would have it? One might answer in the affirmative, at least if one were convinced that the conditions of peace are fundamental for the very possibility of philosophy itself. Philosophy falters when forced into serving the political ends of the moment at the expense of its autonomy. Philosophy also falters if it is compelled to cede to nihilism a centrality in human affairs, at least without first putting up a robust critical resistance. Are not these factors together pointing to an overriding necessity of peace for philosophy? Is it not only in the condition of peace that philosophy enjoys the requisite critical distance for any proper reflection on war and its violence, or any proper reflection at all? It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the problem of peace is the essential problem for philosophy, providing the fulcrum for the entire endeavor of a possible philosophy of war. It is also difficult to avoid certain doubts regarding the very possibility of such a philosophy. For the problem of peace raises the essential question whether becoming a partisan of peace in order not to become a lackey of war does not itself risk a loss of autonomy, and with that, the loss of a properly philosophical perspective. It is essential that we ask, as does Levinas in the first pages of Totality and Infinity, whether we have become the dupes of peace in its morality. And here I quote Levinas, "The moral consciousness can sustain the mocking gaze of the political man only if the certitude of peace dominates the evidence of war." Close quote. It is all too clear that such certitude often betrays a naivete that is just as much an anathema to philosophy as its submission to the putative evidence of war and the politics that direct it. Nevertheless, the problem of war is not reducible to the problems of violence or the question of peace, nor to warfare and politics. There are other equally troubling dimensions of the experience of war, and accordingly other ways in which the problematicity of human existence comes to expression. The question of sacrifice is perhaps the most poignant in this regard, and the reflections of Yampatoshka on the themes of sacrifice and war, to which I will now turn, are of particular interest. I have a note here that this is when I should take a drink of water. So.
Could you speak a little bit slower?
More slowly?
A bit more
loud.
Precise. Such a similar tone, the whole thing. I didn't understand 30% of what you said.
Okay, I'll see if I can do better in this second part. In his 1972 Varna lecture, Yampatoshka takes pains to disassociate a novel sense of sacrifice he is seeking to articulate from older, more traditional, or even archaic conceptions. Sacrifice in its traditional mythical religious sense, Yampatoshka explains, involves the binding of a higher being to oneself and one's interests through a process of exchange. In this sense of sacrifice, one orchestrates a loss but only to gain something from somewhere else, something ontically specific for oneself or for the community, from an equally ontically specific deity or sacred power. This act of voluntary loss makes sense only if something like a relation to some higher being or domain of existence has in some fashion been established and can be relied upon to make sense of an act that would otherwise amount to mere destruction. Yet in the modern world, Patočka argues, there really are no distinctions in the order of being. Rather, all hierarchy is arbitrarily subjective, and practically there are only quantitative differences of power. Older forms of sacrifice are rendered obsolete, their performance in this context impotent and hollow, for they no longer have an anchor in the order of things. From this viewpoint, Patočka concludes, to continue speaking of sacrifice is an inconsistency and a prejudice. To be sure, such inconsistency and prejudice are only evident from the sober perspective of rational assessment. The lingering symbolic forms of archaic notions of sacrifice remain as cultural and psychological survivals that are often appropriated to great effect for the ends of power, as the familiar loathsome operetta of modern war propaganda all too amply demonstrates. In effect, to speak of sacrifice, again from the point of view of sober assessment, risks complicity in propagating a myth that has been cynically instrumentalized for the purposes of mobilization. If the modern age of techno-power has essentially leveled everything to that which is on demand, capable of being organized in accordance with the prevailing needs of conflict and escalation, then sacrifice is either an empty euphemism for resource consumption, or it is a ruse utilizing traditional symbolic forms to wed individuals ever more tightly to their roles, or it is inscrutable. It is perhaps, in my view, best to understand Patočka as making the argument that sacrifice has become all three at once, but with an emphasis on the philosophical significance of its inscrutability. This inscrutability represents for Patočka an index of resistance. Sacrifice expresses an inner reticence of humans to being deployed nakedly as a resource, insisting that there is a difference between the use of life and its inner meaning, between a role assigned by the community and the life that lives in its performance. Sacrifice expresses the reality that humans are not mere things, that lives are not merely disposable, and it shows this precisely where humans have been made into things and disposed without any apparent reserve or restraint. It is important to emphasize that sacrifice expresses this reticence, this reserve, not because it affirms anything like an inherent moral value or purpose to human life. It does not deny the moral value of life, but neither does it rely upon it, as if moral value alone counted as a liberating force. This is for the simple fact that there is no effective resistance to techno-civilization. All value, even the most cherished values of the spirit, are ultimately complicit in its machinations, for value as such manifests in this world only as a force, if it manifests at all. The resistance of sacrifice does not consist in the limiting or expanding effects of value, but only in an ontological strife within the openness of existence itself, an implicit clamoring of problematization inwardly troubling the machinations of total power. Yet for all that, Patočka still claims that, quote, in a sacrifice, the idea of a difference in order is contained in the true sense of the word, close quote. The break from older mythical religious senses of sacrifice is not a rejection on Patočka's part of this difference, but its transposition from the idea of an ontic order between the sacred and the profane to that of an ontological order between beings and the being of beings, between what it means to be and the originary uncovering from which this meaning emerges. Sacrifice, in other words, must be conceived in a demythologized form. Demythologized, ontologically oriented to the ground of being instead of an ontically determinate presence of the sacred, sacrifice in this sense does not and cannot in the age of technology manifest itself in mythical religious terms. It cannot fit into any distinct ethical, theological, or cosmological profile of a relation between beings. It is a difference in order that refuses to be captured by a metaphorical contrast between different kinds of things. hence its inscrutability, and with that its proximity to a certain register of mystical experience. The primary mode of the manifestation of demythologized sacrifice is arguably on the order of mood. Sacrifice is born of the mood of non-indifference. For, quote, a person does not sacrifice something that is indifferent to him, something that does not concern him, close quote. Non-indifference, heightened into the resolve of an act of destruction and refusal, solidifies the sense of a difference in order, and with that the appeal of meaning to the ground of meaning. It stiffens in this way against the leveling indifference of techno-civilization, disrupting its metaphysical closure. As a mood, sacrifice is an attunement not to the ordering power of a hierarchy of values or beings, but to the rumbling of a deeper conflict below the surface of the ordering of life, to the tension in being itself, which Patočka elsewhere does not hesitate to call divine. The non-indifference of sacrifice, however embedded in a reality of force and violence it may otherwise be, renders it irreducible to the utilization and consumption of resources, which obeys only the anonymous logic of increase, escalation, and expansion. Expenditure in the case of sacrifice cannot be exhausted by the indifferent forces in bondage to which it may be otherwise deployed. However bound with the fate assigned to it by the forces of the moment, sacrifice remains reticent. It remains above all immune to that blind indifference of the old man in Wilfred Owen's The Parable of the Old Man and the Young, which renders the story of Abraham as having him refuse the ram offered by the angel as a substitute for the sacrifice of the son. But the old man would not do so, but slew his son and half the seed of Europe, one by one. This cold modern Abraham is deaf to the entreaty of the ethical being called out to him by the angel. Sacrifice continues unabated in the form of an indifferent transposition of one thing into another, of living seed into corpses, according to the pitiless logic of an increase and expansion of power alone. But this is only on the surface. Inwardly, the slain harbor a secret inner resistance to prevailing indifference, thanks to which sacrifice does not merely add to the pile. A sacrificial victim is not simply used up. The act of submission of the seed of Europe described by Owen is not reducible to the old man's mechanical pulsion of death, one by one. Sacrifice in its inscrutable inwardness, founded in the non-indifference of care, affirms despite everything that a price is borne and not merely extracted, a cost is shouldered and not merely expropriated. The old man, indifferent to all this, is both deaf to the ethical and blind to the existential drama of atonement written on the palimpsest of the history he believes to be composed by power alone. In this fashion there emerges a double meaning, however ambiguous and inscrutable, to those grim expenditures of the conflicts of the 20th century. To quote Patočka again from the Varna lecture, revolutionary and warlike conflicts of our century were born of and born by the spirit of a technical domination of the world. But those who had to bear the cost were in no case a mere store of disposable resources, but something quite irreducible to that. That precisely comes to the fore when we speak of sacrifices. Close quote. Strikingly for Patočka, when we speak of sacrifices, this we is not limited to those who have directly experienced the front line, such as Ernst Junger or Teilhard de Chardin, those literary witnesses of the life at the peak called upon to such effect in their radical essays, or to those who have suffered comparable extremes. In some fashion, the meaning of sacrifice belongs, on different registers to be sure, to the common horizon of contemporary existence. To some extent, all of human life has become inscribed in an order of things dominated by the grammar of violence and the indifferent machinations of power. Accordingly, the wars of the past century are significant in that they distill for Patočka something essential to the modern condition as a whole, in such a way that humans can be said to always find themselves enmeshed in some form of war, enduring the strife of one of its myriad theaters, whether hot or cold, global or local, patent or latent. For this reason, it is arguably not the First World War that is Patočka's real subject, but the reality of the Cold War that is both its legacy and fulfillment. It is a reality for which the front line continues to be present as an inner movement of existential resistance, the drama being played out at the heart of a world wholly consumed by force. Here we can quote the radical essays again. Currently, war has assumed the form of that half-peace wherein opponents mobilize and count on the demobilization of the other. Even this war has its front line and its way of burning, destroying persons, robbing them of hope, dealing with them as with material for force being released. The front line is a resistance to such demoralizing, terrorizing, and deceptive motifs of the day. It is a revelation of their real nature. It is a protest paid for in blood, which does not flow but rots in jails, in obscurity, in life plans and possibilities wasted, and which will flow again once force finds it advantageous. It is to comprehend that here is where the true drama is being acted out. Freedom does not begin only afterwards, after the struggle is concluded, but rather has its place precisely within it. That is the salient point, the highest peak from which we can gain a perspective on the battlefield. Close quote. This perspective on the battlefield and the front line of resistance to the deceptions of the day on which it rests endures, but is not for all that something stable or reliable. However much it may belong to the existential dynamics of the age, it is not something which by virtue of its mere expression yields a transformation of the whole. If anything, the existential resistance of the solidarity of the shaken is shrouded in an atmosphere of failure, of waste. Yampatoshka is thus at pains in the radical essays to acknowledge a failure to realize what is implicit in the frontline experience, a failure to unfold its meaning in a way that would lead humanity out of the monotony of repeated devastations and the darkness of moral resignation. Yampatoshka's conception of the solidarity of the shaken is meant in part to formulate a response to this failure. Yet it is important to emphasize that the solidarity of the shaken does not reverse the failure. It only refuses to accept it as conclusive. The solidarity of those who have been exposed to the truth, to the peak of existence experienced in acute confrontation, from which a will to self-sacrifice emerges, is in the end not a solution, but the indication of a continuing struggle in the face of the fact that, quote, we continue to be fascinated by force, allowing it to lead us along its path, fascinating and deceiving us, making us its dupes, close quote. Humans remain, despite the shocks of the experiences of the 20th century that have repeatedly put them face to face with the truth of themselves, the dupes of raw power, at best dissidents in a world all are powerless to change. In all Yampatoshka's engagements with the figure of sacrifice, from its articulation in a reflection on the metaphysical essence of techno-civilization and the experience of modern war, the memory of Jan Palach, university student who set himself on fire in public protest of the Soviet invasion in 1968, is arguably not far from the surface. Palach's self-immolation can be taken to illustrate Yampatoshka's portrayal of sacrifice as inwardly meaningful, if also outwardly futile. It expresses the same attunement of non-indifference, the same resistance to the hegemony of power, as well as the same preserving inscrutability of sense Yampatoshka seeks to describe. Though he does not do so explicitly in the Varner lecture, or to my knowledge anywhere, Yampatoshka provides the means to interpret Palach's self-sacrifice as a radical act of refusal, a pulling back of life itself from all that would seek to submit it to an external bondage, and this way is representing an expression of a quintessential freedom. At the same time, Yampatoshka's reflections hardly quell doubts one might harbor regarding the meaning of Palach's sacrifice, doubts that it was more than a waste of a life still full of the promise of youth. Such doubts apply equally to the loss of a generation in 1914-18 that have been repeated in the efforts to extract some meaning from the subsequent paroxysms of war, revolution, and Holocaust ever since. There is always something of a misdirection in using the very language of sacrifice, something of a failure to take full responsibility for the utter meaninglessness that haunts any attempt to come to terms with things with which no one in their right mind could possibly come to terms. If anything, such doubts are exacerbated by Yampatoshka's reflections. Why did Palach's sacrifice have such resonance? Why did it move so many? That it did is beyond doubt. But why would the willful forfeit of one's own life seem to speak louder than other, less wasteful but equally genuine articulations of conscience, even of protest? Had some hard conviction taken hold, perhaps after so many catastrophes and so much death, to the effect that the world had become so deadened, so exhausted, that something as shocking as burning oneself alive in public had become necessary, as visible proof that at least someone is still alive, someone who can still feel, who can still care about life. And if Pollock is not an isolated phenomenon, but symptomatic of the human condition in the contemporary age, is the conclusion that nothing short of the sacrificial embrace of death is required to be heard across the wasteland of force to which the world has been abandoned by history. Even if one were to be convinced that sacrifice in this sense requires or captures something essential about the spiritual condition of the age, it is hard to miss a certain irony. Part of what drives all this is a sense that life and death have become routinized, fitted within a calculation that seems to demonstrate nothing less than the utter meaninglessness of both, that both life and death are determined solely by force alone and are thus stupid. Suddenly, despite all its trappings of futility, sacrifice seems to rob life and death of their calculability, not by giving one or the other incalculable value, but by forcing a contrast between the inscrutability of sacrifice and a life no longer worth living, and with that somehow succeeding in the expression of something fundamental about human freedom. At one point in the Varna lecture, Yampatoshka sallies a distinction that is fraught with ambiguity, even if it is also demanded by the logic of his thought. He distinguishes between what one might call naive and critical sacrifice. The term critical sacrifice is not Yampatoshka's, but I would argue is consistent with his reflections. The former, naive sacrifice, is that willing sacrifice out of the mood of non-indifference I have already described. The latter, critical sacrifice, is an expansion of willing sacrifice into an explicit consciousness of what is existentially at stake, thus critical in the sense of raised to a higher, more philosophical level of reflection. The first encompasses all those who have sacrificed themselves in the conflicts of the age, in its wars and revolutions. They have sacrificed willingly out of a genuine non-indifference, but at the same time naively, without full awareness or understanding of the relation to truth at work in the inscrutability of their actions. In the second, critical sacrifice, Yampatoshka understands those, quote, who have undertaken the repetition of the experience of the sacrificial victim, thereby prying it out of forgetting, close quote. That is, those who have made explicit what had been only implicit in the first naive form of sacrifice. And here I quote Yampatoshka again. The repetition of sacrifice presupposes a voluntary self-sacrifice, just as in the case of the naive sacrifice, but not only that. For if in this repetition the central point is the overcoming of the technical understanding of being, which is the basis for the non-acknowledgement and vanity of sacrifice, then the naive stance with respect to sacrifice will no longer do at all, close quote. This revealing, and in that sense critical repetition, transforms naive sacrifice from an unreflective resistance, inscrutable to techno-rationality, into a reflectively determined protest directed against the dominant understanding of the age. Quote, the entire mode of acting needs to be understood as a protest, not against individual concrete experiences, but in principle against the understanding by which they are born, close quote. In repetition, the non-indifference native to naive sacrifice is thus leveraged into a thinking that seeks to make visible what has become unfamiliar in technology, the human relation to truth, to the manner of its unveiling as retreating ground. A living sense of problematicity constitutes in this way for Yampatoshka a basis for protest. More, it represents an eminently concrete impetus as a mood of non-indifference expressing itself in practical action. Sacrifice is thus a genuine phenomenon of active resistance and protest, one that is explicitly determined according to the dynamics of the existential movement of truth. More basic than either idea or purpose, sacrifice in this way comes to represent, in Yampatoshka's reflections, a fundamentally human act of freedom, one that perhaps presages a new form of the care for the soul. Yet at the same time, neither the naive act of sacrifice nor its critical repetition in the form of explicit protest has any content for Patočka. This thesis is perhaps the most difficult aspect of Patočka's thought. However reflectively determined, there is no positive idea at the core of critical sacrifice, no call to arms for a new prince-side of any logic of determination. Sacrifice is not only for nothing, but for no one, at least no one seen from the point of view of those who as individuals would demand a right of value or life. In this way, and here I quote, sacrifice requires a remarkably radical and paradoxical form. It is not a sacrifice for something or for someone, even though in a certain sense it is a sacrifice for everything and for all. In a certain essential sense, it is a sacrifice for nothing, if thereby we mean that which is no existing particular. Close quote. Whether or not Patočka's conception of sacrifice might be germane to the problems of the philosophy of war and nihilism with which I began, it clearly resonates with the political act of Palach and many others. This is no accident. Patočka is arguably seeking in these brief engagements with the problem of sacrifice to grasp the meaning of precisely such extreme acts of protest, interpreting their excess as expressing something fundamental regarding the human condition. Yet can one ascribe to Palach those motivations and that awareness that Patočka details under the rubric of sacrifice understood as a species of critical self-awareness? Perhaps, but only if one can assert with confidence that Palach's act did not arise from a sense of arbitrary futility, that it was instead predicated on an awareness of the saving potential of an extreme freedom, when that ultimately has no content apart from the fundamental relation of humans to the very nullity of their finitude. If, in other words, one can distinguish meaningfully from the angle of a public view between an act of nihilistic desperation and an existential responsibility grounded in a freedom for death. Perhaps one should be wary of trying to come to any firm conclusions. There's arguably a consistent mix of doubt and conviction, of failure and promise that characterizes what might be called the modern history of sacrifice that unfolds in the course of the 20th century. Patočka's most difficult thought, arising from the appropriation of diverse Heideggerian motifs that take on a unique constellation in his own thinking, is perhaps a case in point. Patočka seeks a radical conception of sacrifice singularly appropriate for the spiritual challenges of an age of power and domination, when they would free humans from the bondage of life, but precisely by having no content, seemingly turning the very emptiness of nihilism against itself. His conviction is that the nothingness inherent to human finitude forms an axis of orientation thanks to which a radical need for meaning basic to human existence, the affirmation of which is the mainstay of Patočka's philosophy, can be addressed, not by way of its satiety, but through the affirmation of the need itself, in the very depths of its utter abandonment, as something thanks to which one is able to remain fundamentally human in an increasingly inhuman world. Having already registered a certain wariness for conclusions, I will simply end my remarks here, and I thank you for your patience.
So here is, and this is basically all I'm asking you. I want to push you out a bit. You have three main words in the title of your talk today: philosophy, sacrifice, war. All of your paper is about the intricate relationship. Very, very many wonderful thoughts that you have in your paper on that. But still, in the discussion now, I would want to move you out to the open field a bit more and tell us about the relationship of these three. This is my basic and maybe my only request to you. So I have no real questions, but I have a lot of things to share with you, or a few reflections related to that. And I will start with a very simple observation. Your talk speaks about the philosophy of Yampatoshka, but it does so, but it does speak only about a very, very short part of his philosophy, We have thousands and thousands of pages written by Yampatoshka. We have maybe a few dozen pages that 80 or 90% of the Patočka reception relates to. This is remarkable. This is a remarkable fact in itself, just to start with it. No exception, James Dodd today. I mean, you have done much better. You have done a lot, so this is not an accusation of you. But I mentioned in the beginning, James Dodd, you edited, for example, the Body Community Language World lectures, very, very fine phenomenological observations. You edited Introduction to Husserl's Phenomenology. It is all read, it is all spoken about, but to a very, very small degree, right? Though they are very wonderful phenomenological pieces, I mean, totally comparable to Merleau-Ponty or others. I think this is an observation in itself, and I want to give it a certain connection to the topic of your talk. What you are referring today to is the heretical essays, and that is the Varna lecture, I think exclusively. Maybe you have one or two references to other, but I think it's mainly that, right? It's,
yes.
It's exclusively that, yeah? The Varna lecture is this lecture with a very, very complicated title that nobody can ever recall. It has the dangers of technicization. This is the part that relates to Husserl, and it has the essence of technology as danger. This is the part that relates to Heidegger. Why is it worth an observation valuable in itself that everybody is speaking about this? We are reading, and almost exclusively reading, the philosophy of Yampatoshka of the years 1972 until his death, 1977. 1972 is the year when Patočka leaves university. He was allowed to go back to university in 1968. He was teaching at university, and 72 was the year of his pension. He could officially go to pension. They did not want to make an extra case by firing him before that, so they let him go to the pension. This is his university career is over. What starts in these years after 1972 is a totally new epoch of his life. And I can say, I cannot otherwise but be somehow fascinated by the 65-year-old man who starts a new life. It's remarkable. I mean, it is something. He goes out. He really, he dares to go to the open field. He does something completely different. In German, we would say he leaves his Studierstube. He goes out of his study room all of a sudden. Still, he spends most of his time in the study room, obviously, but he has all these weird meetings. You know, they meet in the cellars of hospitals. They go to underground seminars. They do all these strange things that the dissident circles at that time did, and Patočka voluntarily, involuntarily becomes a part of that. I think really voluntarily one should stress that. Yeah, a colleague of mine whose paper I read a few days ago characterized him as a reluctant existentialist. I think this is quite a nice characterization. Everything in Patočka is a bit reluctant. He didn't want to be a dissident. He didn't want to be an existentialist. Everything is a bit reluctant. But 65 years old, somehow it is impressive. I mean, he goes out, he dares to really start something new. He's meeting all these weird people, you know, at least much more weird than the professors that he had to do so far in his life. He's meeting these, you know, artists, psychologists, nuclear physicists. All of them obviously have given up their careers. Hardly anybody of them has a job. So this is the circles, and these are the 5 years from here to death. These are the 5 years, and the writing of these 5 years. This is what we are reading today. 80%, 90% of Patočka reception. It's a remarkable thing, isn't it? If any proof is needed that the attempt to think out of your own existence is somehow effective, is somehow meaningful, I would say, here it is. So, why did I start with this observation? You already see the connection, I think, also to the topic of our talk. Because sacrifice, the main category of what your talk was about, sacrifice is not a topic to Patočka. It is not an idea. Sacrifice is there. This is lived reality of these 5 years. It just enters. It's unavoidable. Yeah, he has to speak about it. if you read into the discussions of this time with the students, if you read into it, it's I mean, to me, it's, even today, it's fascinating to read these discussions. They meet for these underground seminars afterwards. They're discussing Plato or whatever, and afterwards they're discussing, so is it for me as a young human being, as a young student of this time, should I ever work? Should I have a job? Is it needed to have a job? Is it good to have a job? Why should I have a work? We are living in the wrong society. What should we do in this wrong society? What are our convictions? What is it worth living for? And they are discussing, and this relates it to Katka's main topic of these 3 days, they are discussing eminently religious, existential questions. At one point of their discussions, this I would find also a very great thing, they are discussing Christian dogmas. And Yampatoshka says, you know, the Christian dogma, this is also a search. You cannot think that a Christian dogma is like sitting in a bath tube and you are surrounded by this water. This is also a search. And that kind of theological questions connected to the most obvious everyday questions of what should I do, how should I live, how should I integrate in this society, or rather not integrate in this society. This is the Yampatoshka of these years. This dimension, I think, James, you very nicely bring into your talk by the referencing of Jan Palach, whom you mentioned at a later point of your talk, and then 2 or 3 times again. So I come back to my initial starting point. 3 questions. War, sacrifice, philosophy. How are they interrelated? What can we tell about all 3 of them? You start with 2 problems first. You said, before I go to start about all 3 of them, I have 2 things first. The first issue that you're discussing is violence. And in discussing violence, you have words like elusive, you refer to hazard, to chance. So the idea about violence, your understanding of violence, that there is no calculability. No calculability of violence, and this leads you to the conclusion there's also no calculability of war, despite of all attempts of a technicized war to make war calculable. In the end, it is not calculable. At one point you say war is not an art, war is an art, not a science, a somewhat controversial statement if one has it just as its own. But your main point here is that violence in the end points to utter nihilism, and nihilism, that is what is at the core of war to you. And that means your question of philosophy and war, what is a philosophy of war, is transformed into the question of a philosophy of nihilism. And then you have these 2 options saying, nihilism, how to deal with nihilism, either we have to overcome it, or is it for philosophy totally impossible to ever render and come to terms with nihilism? You give no answer to that. You leave it open. And somehow the answer is meant to be given in your dealing with sacrifice. Second preliminary remark, you have violence. The second is peace. You say, well, what else could philosophy be than a partisanship of peace? Because if it were not a partisanship of peace, it would be mere barbarism. So it has to be a partisanship of peace. But the problem of peace is so in that sense the problem of peace is essential for philosophy, yet you say, and this is a quote of your paper, you utter certain doubts if such a philosophy is even possible. You very nicely bring in the quote by Levinas that we should try to avoid to become the dupes of peace and its morality. Once again, in this attempt to deal with peace, we somehow end in limbo. We do not come to a conclusion. The main point is once again transferred or postponed. We come back to the main issue, and this is what the issue that comes now, sacrifice. We are speaking about sacrifice. You very nicely differentiate, and you say, obviously what we mean with sacrifice, what Yampatoshka means with sacrifice is not the calculated sacrifice that is objectively counted in. So if a war machinery counts with a sacrifice of soldiers, this is the objective sacrifice in some sense. This is the peak, this is the most cynical part of all instrumentalizations of human beings. But what we go for is a deeper form of sacrifice. And here comes another word, really the key word, And I found it very interesting to see how often you have it in your paper. It's just an observation. Inscrutability and inscrutable. I think it comes like 15 or 16 times in your paper. Inscrutability. So not an inscrutability for us epistemologically, that we could not define what sacrifice it is, but inscrutability as a quality itself of sacrifice, or what sacrifice is. It has a quality of inscrutability. It is resistance, it is reticence, and it is a life lived and maybe performed against any kind of objectification. What I like very much in your paper is that when speaking about this idea of sacrifice as a resistance, is that you're not invoking any new values, any other values, any better values. Remember Levinas, we should not become the dupes of peace and its morality, but that you very strongly stay with this line of the sacrifice for nothing and all the quotes that you have in there. One very nice sentence I have in your paper, I will quote it again to have it for the discussion. Sacrifice in its inscrutable, sacrifice in its inscrutable inwardness, founded in non-indifference of care, affirms, despite everything, that a cost is shouldered and not merely expropriated. Maybe the essence of your paper to me, as I understand it. So here we are at a point where sacrifice is a dimension where a meaning emerges, but, as you continue to say, an inscrutable and ambiguous meaning. This is the point when you bring in Jan Palach. All of a sudden, your philosophical paper gets a very clearly pointed reference to one person who self-immolated in Prague in 1969, in January 1968. You say, in this self-immolation, in this self-sacrifice of Jan Palach, there was immediately, there is a meaning, there is an inward meaning, and I can only very much confirm so. Palach did this on January 16. He died January 19. He had 3 days in hospital in between. There were talks with him. There is written testimony of him that we have before he did this, and he said this. The reason for doing this was against hopelessness. He wanted to protest against hopelessness. This is his own claim. So obviously there is this meaning. There is an inner meaning out of the acting of Jan Palach. There is resistance, there is reticence, there is a refusal, we could say, to mobilize and a refusal to be mobilized. But still, there is not only this inward dimension, there is also an outside dimension of this sacrifice. And you have this very nice reference where you say, why did Palach's sacrifice have such resonance? Why did it move so many? That it did so is beyond doubt. This is the quote of your paper, James. Indeed, it very, very clearly did so. We had 200,000 people the very same day on Václavské náměstí going to the place of the self-immolation. I mean, this is really a thing that moved people, that was not only meaningful for him, but that did something. 10,000 people came to his funeral. It was a demonstration, we can say. It clearly had a resonance. However, my question, is this resonance needed, and is it needed for the account of sacrifice that you are speaking about in your paper? As you might know, many more young people in the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia at that time did the very same thing. There is estimates that it was several dozens. In the official sources, at least 5 or 6 or 7 of them are known by name, but there's estimates that it was even many more. The second one was Jan Zajíc, another student about the same age. The resonance was much, much smaller, and there were many, many more, and they had almost no resonance whatsoever. My simple question, is their sacrifice less meaningful because there was little or no resonance? I think this is something that we cannot avoid this question. 2003, how many years I have to count now? 35 years later, 34 years later. Palach, by the way, was not 68; it was 69. It's over, but it was after the invasion. 2003, Zdeněk Adamec, a young man of about the same age from a very provincial Czech town, Humpolec, bought a train ticket, drove to Prague, and immolated himself on the very same spot where Jan Palach did the same thing 34 years earlier. Zdeněk Adamec said, "This I do to protest, quote, against the rule of money." This was his statement. Tonight, right now, in Burgtheater in Vienna, we have a play by Peter Handke, Zdeněk Adamec, that is dedicated to him, and Handke wrote this piece after he read about Zdeněk Adamec. It is put on stage by Frank Castorf, a very controversial director, so we have it running tonight, Castorf, Handke, Zdeněk Adamec. And for Handke, he said, this matter of Zdeněk Adamec for him was so fascinating because, and this is the true things that he mentions, because of the radicalism and of the unconditionality of this doing. I think this radicalism and this unconditionality somehow also brings us back to the discussion that we had yesterday when we were speaking about the frightening aspects of Patočka's philosophy. And now I mean it not so much as the frightening aspects of this philosophy, but the frightening aspects of this topic of inconditionality and irreconcilability. But I would say, and this is then really my final statement, I would say we should try to read it in a much broader sense and not only in this very, very narrow sense of a self-sacrifice and of the most extreme case of self-immolation or of sacrificing your own life for something. But we should try to see it in a much broader sense. And this brings me back to my initial start of what I just said. This brings me back to Patočka leaving his study room. I think this is also in some case a sacrifice that I would count as a sacrifice. It is something that creates meaningfulness, and this is why I started my observation with this like very biographical thing, which I think has a very, very intimate relationship to the topic in itself. So the will, the power, the energy to delve into it, to somehow go to the open field. This is what Patočka does, and I think this is the, as I see, the much broader understanding of the topic of sacrifice. Thank you.
Thank you. So I just say first off that all the aspects of what you just said, all of your comments, I'm very sympathetic to. Maybe above all, the comment that this what I'm talking about in this paper, what we were talking about yesterday, and I imagine what sort of the focus of this conference really is a very small piece of the work of Patočka. And frankly, my own engagement with Patočka was through and because of phenomenology, trying to understand just what the possibilities of this type of philosophy are. And in particular for me, the highest mark of, I think, Patočka's genius is the kind of philosophical anthropology he develops in the three movements. For me, this is where I spend most of my time in the fields of Patočka, reading and thinking. And the link with that broader philosophical project that is apparent here, I think, is this theme of non-indifference. And the way in which Patočka understands that in his attempt to articulate, well, two things. One, what we might call the theme of the world or the theme of the whole and our relation to it, and the peculiar sense in which something like the whole of what is comes into focus as a problem for human life, as constitutive of what it means to exist in a human fashion, let's say. And also something which we talked about yesterday, namely this thesis that of a fundamental need for meaning, that the whole or the way in which we inhabit time requires some sense of its sense, if you will, that we can't just live in a kind of emptiness of meaning in which the mere passage of the moment as a brute passage has no basis for articulating its purpose or its sense. This is, I think, an important thesis of Patočka's. It's the basis of his critique of Nietzsche, the idea that nihilism can be something real and not something that's either simply a breakdown and a collapse of the human condition, but rather that something like nihilism is really fundamentally an impossibility, even if it very much determines the philosophical moment, if you will. So I think there is a way in which, vis-a-vis your first comment about how, there's the rest of Patočka's philosophy that we need to consider here or also take seriously. I think it is a misfortune that we do spend far too much time talking about these particular passages in a very limited moment. So I'm very sympathetic to that. I'm also very sympathetic to thinking about the kind of philosopher that Patočka is with regard to the concrete situation of his life. I think that's something we need to do with any philosopher. But in particular, the kind of philosophical projects, and I say projects plural because I think Patočka was eminently experimental, they were, I think, always tied in to a very concrete engagement with the spiritual condition of the age, whether it's through Masaryk and the situation of Czechoslovakia, post-Habsburg Empire, Central Europe, the questions of history and meaning and religion, and all these things always played a fundamental role for Patočka, and they always ought to be understood, I think, through as much as one can possibly reconstruct an understanding of the concreteness of his life, and especially towards the end. I like very much this idea of a kind of almost Socratic second sailing, right? Of a shift or a recalibration of one's entire philosophical project as a project of a kind of renewal, I would even say. And I think that's something which is a very fruitful way of approaching Patočka in the 70s. And in particular, and perhaps most importantly, that the real ether of that development was his concrete engagements with his students, not just his students, but with Havel's theater. I mean, all kinds of different places in which he took philosophy out of the normal kind of practices in which we expect philosophy to unfold, events like this or student-teacher engagements and what have you, into something much more keyed to the sense of loss and catastrophe, which I think was palpable for his times. There's a line. So Patočka, those of you might know, there's some interesting correspondence between Christophe Markowski and Yampatoshka from this period, from the 70s, in which Markowski, writing a dissertation on Heidegger in the worst possible place in the world to try to write a dissertation on Heidegger, namely 1970s Poland in many ways, develops a correspondence with Patočka in order to talk about his project. And Patočka has some very sort of insightful, but also from a personal point of view, illuminating remarks about Markowski's work. And one of them is that he says that it's clear that Heidegger is not just a philosopher for you, but rather there's a pathos about reading Heidegger as a philosopher for times of catastrophe, I think is what he says, right? In other words, that it's in times of catastrophe that something like the philosophical thought of a Heidegger even begins to make sense. And in a sense, I think that was the kind of thinking that Patočka was very keen in developing, is a philosophy that came from a palpable sense of the disappointment of his times, of the disappointment from the point of view of not just intellectuals and philosophers and those who were excluded, if you will, but rather an overwhelming disappointment that was, in a sense, universal. And so he begins Plato in Europe by registering different, as it were, ways in which this disappointment or this sense of alienation or things out of joint, as it were, provides the very situation in which something like philosophy is occurring. So I think that's spot on, and that's something which I've been writing. I just finished a manuscript on Patočka, and I very much try to make that the organizing set of principles for introducing his thought, because I think it's absolutely essential. What you say about sacrifice, for me, this is, I mean, maybe the overuse of the word inscrutable is something of a defense mechanism, that it's just registering my own misunderstanding that I don't get this, but also what I also fail to get, and that it's something that's a basic question for me, is how broadly can we think about the theme of sacrifice and still remain true to the phenomenon itself, to the complexities of a figure like Palach? And the point about Palach is that Palach moved many, but does the very meaningfulness that he seems to have generated, does that make the act somehow comprehensible? That's part of what I'm trying to resist. In a way, it's some aspect of its incomprehensibility seems to be constitutive of the phenomenon. I think this is, in part, Patočka's point. There is an element of waste, of unjustifiable waste, which is at the very heart of that sacrifice. And that's something which I think Patočka is keen to register. And whether we can take a broader view, I'm not quite sure what you meant by a broader view. If that means using the trope or theme of sacrifice in a variety of different senses in order to discuss sort of any way in which some experience of loss has some kind of deeper meaning or sense attached to it, I'm resistant to that, because again, I'm disturbed by the very theme of sacrifice and troubled by it. I think the part of what is interesting about the approach of someone like Kierkegaard is that there's a monstrosity connected to it that needs to be recognized in order to even begin a serious conversation about what its implications are. And that's part of what I was trying to do by being evasive with regard to conclusions, because I think we have to be inconclusive about sacrifice in some way, just to remain true to the phenomenon, to the kind of spiritual challenge that it represents. That doesn't mean I think we should stop talking about it. It just means that I'm not going to tie it up in a bow and sort of present it, because I can't. I just don't understand it.
There is a monstrosity to it, but this is also precisely maybe what moves people, right? I mean, the fact that it had such a resonance, a big resonance, is precisely that, isn't it? I mean, this is what moves people. And also this brings me back to the little question that I had integrated in my comment. What about the resonance to such self-sacrifices, self-immolation? How much does it affect your understanding, or how crucial is it for our understanding of such deeds?
So I think the idea that sacrifice only has meaning if it's registered by those around, those who witness it and recognize it, that would be too much of a notion of, again, that resonance or recognition being an expression of the kind of force, maybe divine, justifiable force of sacrifice. But then it falls into the symbolic domain, in which it becomes something that, as a symbol for a new nation or a new state, falls right back into the kind of logic of machination, which Patočka wants to argue resisted. So if anything, maybe the ideal of the critical sacrifice is in a way silent and not noticed, not registered, not acknowledged in a sense. And that would be as much of a protest and a resistance, but not one that we could measure by the effect that it has on the consciousness of people. But that's precisely it. If we're always measuring things in terms of the impact or the effect, then we're not measuring, even the attempt to measure it all, there's something misleading about that from Patočka's point of view. I'm not saying I agree with that, because I do think that sacrifices that do have that kind of resonance and that does have that sort of sense of meaning, that this is why we talk about them, right? But the logic of Patočka's thinking, I think, is trying to disabuse us of that, to try to pull us away from it. So.
Anybody who wants to contribute? Adam, please.
Thank you for that talk. I think I would need to read what you have written in order to begin commenting on it in an intelligible manner. In the meantime, I have some questions that hopefully will draw you out a little bit and maybe clarify some of the positions. I think the first question has to do with how these papers would oblige you to read Kant and Perpetual Peace, and in particular the satirical inscription that begins it. As I read that essay, the argument is that it's not rational to hope for peace as a philosopher, because perpetual peace is a graveyard. It's like a death drive, or it's like a Nietzschean nihilism, and the most we can hope for, as set forth in the appendices, is to kind of rework the relationship between philosophers and rulers. It's not, therefore, philosophical to want peace. And so if you may agree or you may disagree with that reading of Kant, but I'm putting it out there as a possible counterpoint to the argument I think you set forth in the second of your provocations, namely that philosophy is a partisanship of peace. So I think the strong form of the reading would be to want peace is nihilistic. It's to want the graveyard. And so I'm curious to hear how you would respond to that reading. And then the second and third have to do with that last exchange that you and Ludger just had, which I found totally fascinating. And I think it's important to talk about Sarah in Kierkegaard, because it's inscrutable to Sarah, yeah? The sense, the monstrosity, as I read Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, is like, she's the one who doesn't understand, who might think it's murder. She's the one who waited 90 years. So the idea of a totally secret sacrifice, at least if that's the kind of paradigm for a sacrifice, it would seem to be unworkable without the gaze of somebody who is saying, I don't understand. This seems like madness. This seems like monstrosity. This seems like murder. And if that's the case, then I think of a different tradition of sacrifice, which is like the scapegoat, or the kind of like the cathartic tradition of sacrifice in the work of René Girard. And that causes me to think that Sarah is not an accident in the history of sacrifice, that you need a spectator, you need resonance, you need an aesthetics of sacrifice in order for there to be a sacrifice. The scapegoat, the purge of the scapegoat. Girard's examples are from like Greek tragedy, Sophocles. Maybe. So is inscrutability therefore like an aesthetic category? Therefore, is it a category of appearance and resonance and all of these things? And if so, that seems to present a problem for the response, which I thought was cogent, that you gave to Ludger, which is like, I can't affirm. Or as you were reading Patochka, I can't possibly affirm an instrumental sacrifice that's theatrical, is in the sense of, sacrificing as a means to the end for a cathartic purge or kind of sacrifice effect on an audience, because that would be instrumentalism, as I think you rightly said. And machine, I think, is even originally a Greek category from the theater, if I'm not mistaken. So that's a question. I guess it's like, is it, if there's a third, or if there's a spectator that's necessary to say of the sacrifice that it's inscrutable, then isn't it an aesthetic category? And if it's an aesthetic category, isn't Ludger's question about resonance, and kind of the path to the kind of instrumentalism that you as a reader of Patochka want to resist? Does the question make sense, or a little bit?
I'm just curious, what do you mean by aesthetic?
I mean, it's the sublime in the Kantian sense, that I'm terrified, like Antigone goes down and she dies, and I find it terrifying and inscrutable in a way that moves me and fills me with terror and pity at the same time. So like rigorously, like Aristotelian, poetic. Okay, I understand. And some Kant too. And then the third question, I'm glad you talked about in your last response, that you're concerned as a kind of philosopher about how broadly to draw this category. Because as I was trying to follow your argument, I thought, well, ontologically speaking, what holds for self-immolation, why wouldn't that hold for like Fanon's like example of the slaughter of, phenomenologically speaking, like the phenomenological account when the settler is killed by the native, and that's a transformative, that's an ontological relation, that's a murder. But Fanon will call it like cathartic. I mean, he'll say that this is a kind of transformative moment, and he'll use the language of phenomenology to talk about that. I wouldn't call it exactly a sacrifice, but I'm going to try to slippery slope you, and in your response, I want you to say, like, my ontological account doesn't cover that. But let me just kind of slippery slope you a little bit more, and then I'll stop. So, like, if the ontological argument covers the settler's murder by the native, right? Because it's cathartic, it's kind of it's non-instrumental, it's like transformative, it transforms the very being of the native. Why wouldn't that hold for the suicide bomber as well? And Achille Mbembe raises that question, I believe, at the end of an essay called Necropolitics. And so, like, that's kind of a provocation, but it's kind of, I'm inviting you to say, like, where ontologically does your account allow us to say self-immolation is one thing, you know, murder, or what appears to me to be murder, or the sacrifice of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, which is killing another person, that's not included in my ontological account of sacrifice. And then finally, I guess, what kind of puts the brake on the slippery slope? Like, what is the kind of ontological difference between self-immolation and suicide bomber? And I know it's a kind of explicit kind of question, but I don't think it's an unwarranted question given the way that you framed a non-indifference. I'll stop there.
Alicia, did you also? No? No? Okay, so then I misinterpreted. Maybe.
So, thank you. I mean, those are all. I mean, you know, I don't have any conclusions. So, in a sense, this is sort of the premise, right? So, but first the Kant, which it really what you said struck me, because you're right. I do try to make some connection between philosophy and peace, essentially saying that philosophy is and must remain. This was meant to be a kind of provocation, a kind of partisan of peace, and that's the only possible way to think about the very possibility of reflection. Now, of course, it has to be a more complicated discussion, right? Especially given if we were to follow this very Patochian account of the genesis of philosophy, is that it is something that is intrinsically related to war. The very education of the Philakes in Plato's Politeia is something that begins as the laying out of the necessary education of the warrior. And that's, as it were, a recognition, at least tacitly, of something like that philosophy must be related to a life that is willing to put itself at risk. And that, in a sense, its relation to freedom is ultimately refracted through that origin story in which a life at risk is the common genesis for both philosophy and politics. So there has to be a more complicated story, even from Patochka's point of view. But nevertheless, I would argue is that both politics and philosophy, as it were, once set into motion, have an equal interest in defending oneself against the momentum, the pressure of the political moment. And in a fundamental way, that's one way to approach the manner in which the philosopher becomes politically ambiguous. And essentially the problem then becomes, and this is the Platonic problem, how is it that the philosopher can, how is it that there could be a community which would accept the philosopher as a philosopher and not somehow be threatened by it? Or a community that the philosopher would want to live in and not attempt to escape in order precisely to be left alone in order to think the good or connect to the ideal. So there's definitely a complicated question there. But when it comes to Kant, I would say something similar happens, is that there is for philosophy to be possible for Kant, some kind of condition of peace, and here I would argue it's essentially civilization, some kind of commonality or set of relations and practices and institutions even, and essentially some kind of stability is required for philosophical activity It's just that the origin of precisely these stable forms, their historical origin, or the historical origin of civilization itself, is precisely through a process of continuous conflict and continuous violence. And so there is an origin story, as it were. The peace we have was born of war. The stability that we depend upon as philosophers is connected genetically to war. But nevertheless, that stability still has to be there for philosophy to be possible. So I think you're definitely right. There's a more nuanced story I have to tell, and I can tell it with both Kant and Patočka. Right? I would argue. So that's the first point. So thank you for that, because I hadn't really made that connection to Kant. The second, this is getting more towards what really troubles me about the whole problem of sacrifice. I do think, and this I think one of the interesting aspects of Derrida is the theme of secret through the whole gift of death, right? Beginning, of course, with the discussion of the secrets of European responsibility. There the focus is much more on the fifth essay and the discussion of European decadence and these passages of we need to demythologize Christianity and all this sort of thing. But I would argue that there's something of, as it were, a kind of role for secrecy in the theme of sacrifice in both the Varna lecture, called the Varna lecture because it takes too long to cite the other title, but also the sixth heretical essay. And that, for me, that's part of what I'm trying to get at with the notion of inscrutability, is the idea that secrecy can have some kind of status as reticence, but at the same time futility, right? So it's a secrecy which is never divulged, which is never really even witnessed. And that's exactly, actually this is the point Derrida makes too about Sarah, right? Is that that she has to be part of this story and has to play a more prominent role. There has to be something of a witness, or as you say, well, that's exactly what you said, and I agree very much with that. But then again, that's also what troubles me about it, right? It can't be a secret. It can't be a secret that's continuously kept. And part of that, I think, is the notion of a critical sacrifice, is that it's not kept. It's a secret revealed. But then again, what's the status of the secret? How does it continue? If it becomes part of a self-articulated understanding of the world, then in what sense is it still operating as a secret, right? It's precisely no longer a secret. And I think that's just an unanswered difficulty with Patočka's, with the line of his thinking, which again is very fragmentary. We're only talking about some very limited engagements with the theme. So I don't take Patočka to have a complete theory of sacrifice, just as little as I have any real complete conclusions about it. The point about Girard, I think that's another interesting sort of dimension to this whole thing. Because of course there's the notion of a more kind of mythical religious conception of sacrifice, which does involve the scapegoat. Greek tragedy, of course, is a important theme in Girard, an important object of study. But also this idea that what the story of Abraham represents is a revolt against human sacrifice and its replacement by something other, right? That the substitute, if you will, in a way buries a kind of secret history of sacrifice as precisely something which was constitutive of religious life or of the communal life. But the monstrosity of that, as it were, didn't undermine or break it. It rather created the conditions in which it became so insufferable that it had to be replaced by something else, which symbolically did the same thing, but no longer actually issued in the form of the act of destruction. So you have a notion of a different, as I read the point, sort of a different permutation of this cycle of destruction as purification that no longer has any kind of real existential content, right? Because it's the ram that's killed and then we all have a nice meal type of thing, as opposed to, all the firstborn somehow being liable or exposed to the possibility of destruction. So that's another, I think the question of the history of sacrifice and the development of different forms in which it manifests itself in religious history. I think this is this is maybe another way to make the whole theme more broad.
Not now.
Not now?
No.
Well, but I'm almost to the last bit. The aesthetic category. Can I do that? You sure?
Yes.
We're running out of time.
Well, I think it has already been a long evening.
I've sacrificed too much of your time. So,
yeah, please.
So, not sublime, because remember the force of the sublime for Kant is the invocation of the sense of our moral purpose, right? That's what drives the sublime. Otherwise, it would just be madness for Kant. He's quite explicit about this, and why the sublime, the analytic of the sublime and the beautiful are so different from each other, right? Because in a sense, it's only because of this connection to a sense of one's moral vocation that the sublime has any kind of purchase at all. Right? So in that sense, I would argue, because again, given the very transient critique of Kant's moral philosophy in the second study of Masaryk, I would suggest that Yampatoshka is also trying to break free from Kant in some basic way. But there's a lot more to say about that, and I won't say it now.
I mean, I, as you have already understood, I have a tendency to say it has already been a long evening and we could quit here, but if there is a really short comment and a really short answer, anybody?
I want to add just another dimension of sacrifice, yeah? Because we spoke about the individual sacrifices now in the last hour. I think a new dimension in the 20th century is the sacrifice of whole people, beginning with the Nazis trying to sacrifice the Jews, but then during the process of the war, sacrificing also their own people, yeah, and half of Europe. And that's another dimension where I think the idea of meaning is missing here. I don't see any meaning, and it's really difficult to understand.
Yes, no, you're right, and I would actually that's very much in line with what I was trying to suggest. Is that the same phenomenon, the same event, right? So this is actually very palpable in debates around war memorials. And such as the unknown soldier, or whether or not to turn the battlefields into sacred places. And the debates are usually, they can be extremely polarized, because for some who would use the religious language of sacrifice, that these are holy places. But for others, it's the exact opposite. They're abominations. And we want to bring our children home. And there was a very difficult, after the First World War, there was a very strong movement to try to bring the dead back home, but it just wasn't possible. And then you had these competing discourses about the tomb of the unknown soldier, which is where this is what essentially invented, as well as what to do with the question of a remembrance, right? And how to try to come to terms symbolically with this event. Do we use the language of catastrophe, abomination, criminality, and evil? Or sacrifice for one's fatherland or homeland or whatever it may be. And of course it becomes even more difficult when you talk about the direct creation of victims through something like the Shoah and the kind of remembrance connected to that. This is a very difficult and a very complicated thing.
Now,
Sorry?
in the Ukraine, we have a similar situation.
It happens, I think this is a constant pattern of modern warfare.
Yeah.
And a mass conflict, if you will. And I would sort of register and sort of say that sacrifice, Jay Winter has some wonderful work on this type of topic, is that the fortunes of the notion of sacrifice, the concept of sacrifice in these contexts waxes and wanes, and it's contested ground, right? I wouldn't take it. To even call Pollack's self-immolation a sacrifice, protest for sure, but whether it's a sacrifice and the kind of what you're trying to evoke with that notion, I think that's still something that is very problematic in fundamental ways. And again, I don't have any conclusions because I just don't think anyone does. So, thank you.
Katka, do you have any final words, or do you have any announcements?
I would maybe like to thank you both for today's evening and the audience and for the questions. And as for announcements, there is the workshop at the theological faculty tomorrow starting at 9:30, and there are some more information on the flyer there where Nikki is sitting on the table. So anyone interested, please grab a flyer and be welcome tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katka, once again for the whole series, as I said in the beginning, and please join me in thanking James for his talk. Thank you, James.